So what do
Okay.
you want to talk about today?
Okay, I'm just trying to make my screen work. I've got that. I'm just trying to get my screen going. Yeah, I'll share my screen. And I thought I might talk just briefly about resiliency because we haven't done it before.
No.
And it's a funny thing, Nippon. So much, and people, when they do sport, they discover the interconnectedness of everything. And I think that's important because I think there's so much in risk and safety that's a grab bag, this here, this here, this here. Whereas I think SPORE is a philosophy before it's anything else. And that's why it holds together. So when I talk about resiliencing, I just want to highlight that it is the outcome of a philosophy. It's not something within itself. So let me just share the screen and you can perhaps ask any questions you want. Okay, so can you see my screen now?
I can, yes.
Okay, and if I change the screen, can you see that?
I can see that, yes.
Okay. The idea of a wave didn't come from me. It's like sometimes what I do in social psychology of risk is I turn something that someone else does very well into a semiotic and I make it visual. And that's what I did with this. The idea of the resilience wave came from my brother, from Graham, who was the manager of the Wayside Chapel, King's Cross for 10 or so years. And, he worked, and you need to understand what he was doing. His chapel was, and still is, the largest not-for-profit, non-government organisation in the middle of Sydney, Australia, 6 million people, working with people on the streets, homeless people, people who are drug addicted, substance affected, Indigenous people, alienated people, prostitutes, etc. That's who the Wayside Chapel worked with. And when you understand the Wayside Chapel and what it does, then you'll understand a bit more about resiliencing. And so my brother, when he often spoke about life, he said our life is like a wave. We just have our ups and downs. And when Graham speaks, he just does it visually, so you can see it like that. And but this is done semiotically, so you can see it in red there, and your life goes up and down, and everyone knows this is true. It's a wonderful metaphor for life. So you have points of exhilaration, and then you have points of depression, and they may not last long. But real life, the life we sustain, is most often somewhere in the middle. So, when I hear young people say, I'm bored, or adults who get bored with life, what they're really saying is they'd rather live life on the highs and they'd rather live life on the lows than live life in the sustainability where it actually wholeness within yourself is sustainable because it's what you do with life. And so we live in a society now that tries to create so many peaks. Everyone jumps on social media looking for those special moments. People share their holidays. Oh, here I am, be envious of me, I'm having my holiday in Chennai, here I am, look at me, I'm having my holiday in Chennai, and that's what, oh, look at me, I'm in Paris, Anyway, so life is like this. So we can only understand resilience in reflection to how we live life. And resilience never stops. So it makes it's not, I don't think it's good to talk about resilience in a static form. It's much better to talk about resilience as something we always do and that's always active. And so resilience meets us at these troughs and these highs and lows. And it's when we access resilience the most is when we are in these highs and lows. So you actually need a sense of resilience when you're in the point of exhilaration, when you're in that point of awesomeness, you know. And it's like my brother would say, you know, you can have this point of the most incredible exhilarance. So you might say, I would rate perhaps the most exhilarating moment of my life was when I was present at the birth of my children. I would rate that as one of the most exhilarating times in my life. But then the next day, you've got a baby that needs feeding, a baby that does a poo, you've got babies that cry, you've got babies that tend to, and guess where you are? You're back to the sustainability of life. The very next day, you're sustaining life. And then, of course, the day after, you may have a mishap or something goes wrong and you've got to take that baby back to the hospital. So within one day, you've gone from this signal up the top, which is the signal is the sign that you're in you're in exhilaration and awesomeness. And then there's a sign that tells you you're in the trough. And your resilience is your ability to read that. So resilience is a sense of wisdom and maturity that helps you read living. Then we have a whole bunch of things in our life that pre-amplify what we experience. And that comes from our birth, our location, our religion, our country, our society, what we fill our heads with, our parenting, and so on. So all of these things that we bring to the wave of life pre-amplify the way we exercise resiliencing. And so that changes there. And that question mark sits at the start because most people, we don't know what their foundation for their life philosophy is. And in social psychology of risk, of course, we know that's called ontology, your theory of being. And so it's from our theory of being that we face the wave. And that's why, for example, I saw young people when I was running a service for young people at high risk, you know, children on the streets, children who are drug affected, children who'd been sexually abused. I saw some are able to sustain the vitality of life in the middle of abuse, and I saw others crushed by it. And I still am in contact with many of the children who are now adults today, who I worked with, who were similar to the people my brother worked with in the middle of Sydney, but I worked with children. I worked with children by the age of 10 and 18, and they had similar stories to tell. So, you know, I had a 12-year-old girl in my service who was prostituting herself at the age of 12. I had heroin addicted children at the age of 13 and so on. I write about that in my first book, right? In my first book. Okay, so
something
you're going.
I wanted to share with you, Rob, as you talked about, I think it would be first there's a question and then there's a comment. The question is for somebody who doesn't understand what is being, because you know you have a question mark there and there's a lot in that question mark to be unpacked. But for somebody who's new to this, what do we mean by you start with your being? What can you give an example or can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Okay. Well, I'll tell my own story. I was born in Western Victoria, in a small country town, to the third son of a religious man, a man who was a fundamentalist Christian, evangelical Christian, and you have no choice of your birth, none, and
No.
what you were born into. And my father was a very loving man, but the society and culture I was born into was a very rigid religious one, full of dogma, and so on, black and white thinking and so on. But it was a family of love, so that was good, and a family of fun. We had lots of fun and love as well. So, you know, you can't paint it as one or the other. But those things were not my choice, and they are not my choice. I was not born in Chennai. I was not born in Paris. I was born in Western Victoria, Australia. And so whether I like it or not, those things shape my cultural ontology. And until I was actually 28, I didn't make any break at all from my family beliefs, from my family ontology, till I was 28. Even though I left home when I was 20, I still held the fundamental philosophical belief system of my parents till I was 28. So these things pre-exist us, and they are not just complex, they're wicked. They are so deeply in us as persons that they are shaped over many, many years. And so you can't talk about a belief as if it's some flippant, you know, concept. Oh, well, I believe in, you know, Vegemite, or I believe in chocolate bars. You know, it's when you talk about belief that's embedded in a deep family history, blended over 20 years, you cannot, in fact, you would be foolhardy to try to propositionally or conceptually describe it, because living is about in your being. It is phenomenally unique to you. And this is what I find so silly when I hear risk and safety people talk about culture as if it's some sort of conceptual, you know, belief system. Like, in fact, it's more how people think of dogma. You know, I believe in these 10 dogmas, so I belong to the Anglican Church, you know, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So sorry?
So I had an example of what you said just now. When I come from India, and the ontology of education, for example, is completely different from the ontology of education in the West.
Oh,
So
yes.
our ontology of education in India is the all-round development of mind, as Durkheim would say. So it's
Yeah.
not really about. So when I first came to the UK, I struggled to grasp the concept of knowledge economy, which
Yeah.
primarily means that education will make you more employable. And I thought, well, if you don't have an education that helps you to develop your mind, how is that then going to turn into employability or social mobility? The
Yeah.
foundation is social is all around development of mind. So this was my being, this was my
Yes.
ontology, this was
Yes.
my history. And you're absolutely right, this is not something that we learn. This is something that is passed on to us from our ancestors. You
Yeah.
could say the archetype.
Yes.
So
Yes.
yeah, I just
Yes.
wanted to share my thoughts with
Oh,
you.
no, you're right.
Yeah,
I mean, most people don't understand that schooling is not about education and learning. People need you in Western society. Schooling is about social reproduction,
that's
and
right. Yes.
unless you have some background in Dewey, Peters, Robinson, Claxton, Paulo Freire, unless you have some background in some advanced educational thinking. Deleuze is absolutely
Oh yeah.
fantastic,
Yeah.
and so on. unless you have some background knowledge in that, education and learning are products, and they speak. I mean, it's a complete it's a complete false mask, like a false archetype. You
Correct.
think you're going to schooling to get an education. You're not. And schooling has been like that as part of the Western economic system for a long, long time, and it's not learning.
No.
Most children in school learn despite of the structure, not because of the structure.
Oh, yes.
I don't think people realize just how much of their, not just their ontology, what they start with, but even their very view of how life is sustained. And now Mark Johnson would call that homeostasis. Damasio would call that homeostasis. What is it that we do that regulates between the troughs and the peaks in our life? And can you be happy there in sustainability? And our society tells us, no, don't be happy, want more, desire more, need more, and so on. And that's a sadness about our society. So the resilience wave starts with going back. And so you and I mean, you could hardly end up with two more radically different ontologies than yours and mine. You know, no similarity at all between Christian faith and Hinduism, no similarity at all between Indian culture and Australian culture, none. Just like, my next door neighbors are Indian and we get on absolutely wonderfully well. But our world teaches us, our Western world teaches us not to love the different things, not to love different people, it tells us to hate them. And so we're brought up with xenophobia and racism and so on. So this is the resilience wave, and you have to understand it before you can understand what resiliencing is, because it's continuing and it moves forward. To use the concept of, when you're down, you bounce back, or when you are in depression, you pull yourself up by your bootlaces and you make yourself better. I mean, so many of the silly metaphors we use for resilience in our society actually makes people anti-resilient. And so most people, by the way, Nipun, have no strategy at all to manage suffering.
No, and reading through so many books on trauma, for example, and stress. I used to work in a company where we invited a consultant, Rob, to give a lecture on resilience. And what struck me the most was that everything that was proposed in that workshop or lecture, whatever you want to call it, was down to individualism. That if you are feeling low, or you're feeling stressed, go and have a glass of water, go for a long walk, go and breathe deep. There was no sense of connectivity. There was no sense of relationship in that discourse.
Yes, that's right. And all of the evidence, if you want to read the research, shows that individualism does not work and does not draw people out of depression. And so what does our society do? They give you a tablet. They give you a pill. And so the real outcome of this wave we're talking about is we have a society in Western society of levels of addiction to medications and substances that is off the planet. It is off the planet. The subscription.
10 different flavors of painkillers.
Yeah, correct. Yeah. So this is the resilience wave. And so when we explain resilience in the social psychology of risk, we go back to ontology and philosophy. Now, okay, so there's the wave. Let's move on. So when we amplify, it has ripple effects. And this comes from the work. And none of this work is my own. I've simply semiotically presented it. The concept of ripple effects and the idea of pre-amplification comes from the amplification of risk by Slovic and some of his colleagues. And I'll come to that later because there are 3 other models to show. So once we've got this idea, we get this idea that your ontology and your question of life and your sustainability has a ripple effect and a trajectory. Where does it take me, right? Where does it take me?
Yes.
And so let's take a simple concept, the idea of zero, right? Which is an ideology, not a number. It's an ideology in the risk and safety world. Well, when you have a dogma of an absolute of zero, the trajectory must go to a position of intolerance. It has to. When you have an ideology of behaviorism, which is common to behavior-based safety, you must have a trajectory to intolerance and to objectification of people. And this is why people don't understand that the very foundations and philosophy and the underpinning foundations of the safety industry in the end have a trajectory to dehumanize people. Okay, so there's the map. Now, what we have that works against the life flow or the flow of life, that works backwards against us, is what we call the wave of resistance. And that's a kind of a fighting back against accepting the flow of sustainability. And this is what, particularly in Western society, we do. And even our schooling system teaches people to resist being happy and content and fulfilled in who you are. You know, I used to have little girls in my my youth service I ran who were taught not to be happy with who they are, and weight in particular, whether they, and none of them were overweight, and some of them were terribly, terribly ill. And their line of resistance was against the sustainability of contentment and fulfillment. And they were taught not to be fulfilled and not to be content. And the worst thing is, Nippon, they had no social cohesion for sustainability. And that's what we need to sustain ourselves in the homeostasis, the equilibrium of life. Yes, we'll have a peak. Yes, we'll have a trough. They are very few and far between.
So Rob, here's something to consider. I don't know if you have read Susie Orbach. She's a wonderful woman. She wrote a book called Fat is a Feminist Issue. You have to read this book, Rob. It's a really, really good book. What she talks about is the idea that there is two ways of creating, reproducing women in the society. One is the obese women, and on the opposite spectrum is the ideal mannequin woman. So, and both are unrealistic. Of course, both is going against the nature, and at both ends you have enormous amount of products to serve both industries. So what you're seeing here is this ups and downs, as you show me, reminds me of that once you go against the nature and you produce these two kinds of human beings, then the market offers enormous opportunities for selling products on both ends.
Yeah, correct. Making money.
Yes, and the interesting thing is, at both ends of the spectrum lies dissatisfaction with life. Whether you are obese or you are whatever,
correct. Correct.
Model, it looks
and
like,
we're back. And of course, that's where the Western schooling system teaches you that life is about producing a product and selling it. And it teaches you that you are a product as well. So this is what we call the resilience wave. And I deliberately put Y in resilience to match the human dimension spelling, because in many ways, our language has been ruined by the misuse of labels and brands, you know, like all sorts of things which people have grabbed the language and ruined it. So whenever we think of, let's say, the word differently, it's not different at all. It's just the brand of differently. So I changed the spelling. But underneath all of this is a dynamic, and it never stops. You do it your whole life. It's called resiliencing. You are always resiliencing. And what we have is a concept which comes from St. Paul, except I don't call him Paul. I just call him Paul of Tarsus in the Bible, a radical thinker. Paul was one of the most radical thinkers in the first century. And this doesn't come from my kind of background in the kind of Christianity I grew up with. But the Apostle Paul uses a word called upbuilding. It's quite unique. It's the same word which we would use, you and I would word for education and learning, upbuilding. It's the building together of persons into a homeostatic cohesion of fulfillment and meaning and purpose in life that does not join the line of resistance. And so we have the lifeline on the far top left up here, and then we have the upbuilding, which is I put there. And then in the middle, we have points of dissonance. And these points of dissonance are absolutely vital. And without a sustainable, supportive family, or a sustainable, supportive group, or a sustainable, supportive culture, these points of dissonance can move you from sustainability and working with the wave of life to then flipping back into the line of resistance and joining in the lovers of technique, which is the lovers of product, and the meaninglessness of selling and producing product. And so that's the resiliencing wave. And then when I do training on this, it actually takes a lot longer than half an hour to work through all of this, because all of it needs to be unpacked. And so sorry, yes?
So Rob, in a way, what you're saying is that if you do not have those social connections in life, if you don't have people to help you, to support you, to have a conversation with you,
Yep.
then there comes those points of dissonance that would very quickly throw you from red into the purple line.
Yeah, correct. And the funny thing is Nippon, the red line is where we are most alive, right? The red line is where we are most aware of our being. So that's the line, and knowing that most of life is sustaining homeostatic regulation in the middle, right? The purple line is the line of seduction. The purple line is the line of false promise, of what we know from Deleuze, from I forget his name, but he calls it false consciousness. And that's the purple line. And it's purple because it offers you this kind of regal, religious-like, ideological type promise. You know, it offers the same promises of a religion. And so it has certain addictions and seductions to it, but it's not real.
No.
So
Rob, you also keep talking about the idea of homeostasis, and you
yes,
and I know what that means. But to somebody who is new to this concept, how would you explain that, and why is it important for sustainability?
okay, everything in our life is homeostatic, everything. My body is regulated at a certain half a degree temperature every day. If my body gets any hotter than that, then I need to see a doctor. There's something wrong. If I get a fever or a temperature, if it gets too low, I've got a problem as well. My heart rate needs to stay between a certain high and a certain low. If my heart rate is not regulated and it goes too low or too high, again, I need to see a doctor. My breathing is regulated. By the way, Nippon, all this is automatic. All of this is
Yes.
unconscious. None of
Yes.
this, we don't think about breathing or blood regulation. So homeostasis is about the concept of life regulation. And we don't only do it physically with our own bodies, we actually do it socially as well. So if I meet someone who is hurtful, who is insulting, who is exploitative, who is rude, who is toxic, I tend to regulate by moving away from them. And so we all forms of things are in this automaticity, this regulation. And the best person to read on this is Antonio Damasio or Mark Johnson on this homeostasis of life. In fact, they use the word most often allostasis,
Yeah.
not homeostasis,
Damasio
allostasis.
doesn't like the word homeostasis. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
that's
Yes.
right. And so that's what we're looking at in the resilience wave here is and this is why social psychology of risk is so important in the risk and safety industry, because it's far more holistic than what you hear. You see, let's say, for example, someone at work gets injured, right? What does the workplace normally do?
Well, the first thing to ask is, was this person wearing the right PPE, this
Yeah,
personal
that's
protective
right.
equipment? Yeah.
That's right.
So so it's almost bullying that person and objectifying
We,
that person, brutalizing that person.
yeah, so we leave the lifeline and we jump into the line of
Purple
resistance.
line. Yes. Yes. Yes.
The moment something goes wrong and there's suffering or there's harm or there's injury or anything like that, we go straight into, and so this is what the risk and safety people do. They teach you to enter the line of resistance. And so the industry doesn't even know what resilience is. It thinks that resilience is you pull yourself by your own bootlaps, somehow you do some miracle to yourself, because you won't be resilient because you don't have a supportive community. You're in a judging community. You're in a brutalizing community. And we saw that in Costa Concordia. Who had
Oh,
to
yeah.
be crucified first of all? The captain. We
Captain.
have to
Yeah.
crucify the captain. Why is that? Well, we're already in the purple line of resilience, of resistance. We're already in it. So we find the scapegoat and now we're all better. And somehow we think that's how we make ourselves resilient, by crucifying someone. So anyway, so that's the model, the semiotic,
Excellent.
my model of resilience. It would take much longer to explain, but I really have one more that I need to go. I need to enter the question
Yes.
mark. So if we go back to the question mark is in preamplification. So here are all the things that form the question of life: your biology, your heredity, and where you came from, even your physical identity, whether you're a colored man or whether you're a white man, a colored woman or a white woman. Your personality type, what you've been gifted with, which of course is not chosen, just like the first three things there are not chosen. You have no choice. And so your personality type, and Jung is by Carl Gustav Jung is a genius. He is by far the best on understanding personality. Then we have learning, and that's not schooling. These are the things which you embody, and seriously, it's about embodying. It's not about cognitivism or rationalism, which is what schooling's about. Then we have our archetypes, the mythical forces and energies which come out of and live in our cultures that form things like lines of resistance. They are mostly archetypical. So, for example, our society tells us to believe that a hero is true, that a guru is real, and they are not real and they are not true. They are just human beings, but we have this society. So this is all part of the pre-question mark. Then we have the collective unconscious, and then we have culture. And
Beautiful.
so these things form the unconscious question that precedes all of life in pre-amplification for how we live along that line. How do we live along that lifeline? And how do we deal with the points of dissonance at the meeting point of resistance and life living? What do we do at those points where we are invited to live in sustainability with contentment and fulfillment, and a society tells us not to hate ourselves and to hate those around us? How's that, Nippon? Is that enough?
You brought it all together so well is all I can say, but there is a lot for me to now ponder about and go in the forest, go on long walks and just contemplate this discussion. Lovely.
Yeah, well, that's
absolutely lovely.
Well, yeah, and I think what currently exists in industry is what I would call the mythology of resilience, and there's nothing better than to get someone to have or to fall into a false consciousness to sell them a product. And so, you know, people go, I once went to a conference on resilience, and they invited these people to present before me who were all, you know, like megastars. They were Olympic athletes and all this, and they're all talking about this individualistic, you know, thing. And I was on the podium with them. Yep. And it was all individualistic, and they were having a group discussion at the end. And I presented, mind you, they're all being paid huge amounts of money to be there. I was not, because I'm not a megastar. But I got to them all at the end on the podium, and I said to them, how many of you could have achieved your gold medal without your families? And they said, oh, none. They all said, no, my family and their sacrifice was central to everything I did to sustain. Oh, good. Why did you not start your talk to this audience of 300 people by telling them about your family? Why did you not start there? And they all fell silent. And of course, then everyone hated me because I asked the question. You mustn't challenge the common paradigm or the common ontology. You mustn't question schooling. You mustn't question Western society. You mustn't question capitalism. You mustn't question consumerism. You mustn't question, you know, the lords and gurus of some cult. You mustn't question these things, you know. And of course, without the question, there's no point of dissonance. And without the question, there's no learning.